Hello, everyone. So my name is Alyssa Ryan, and I'll be our moderator today in this session. Really excited for some really meaningful discussions regarding equity and accessibility in transportation. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, and really excited to introduce our 6 different presentations today. So I'll be going through at the beginning and just introducing each of our speakers, and then I'll pass it along to them to share their screens, present their work, and then we'll have a quick Q&A following each presentation, and then we'll move on to the next one. I'm going to be paying attention to time to make sure we have enough time for all of our speakers. And I think one of our speakers will have one recording today, so they may or may not be available for questions depending upon their internet connection today. So I'll let you know when that comes about. So thank you all so much. And I will start with the introduction of our first speaker. Let me bring that up. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat throughout the duration of today's presentations. So our first presentation will be on darkness and death, walking distances across the US by time of day and time of year. Maithreyi, Vellimana, I apologize if I'm not getting your name quite correctly. Please present yourself when it's your turn to speak. Is a transportation engineering graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds a BS in civil engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Prior to her graduate studies, she gained professional experience as a traffic engineer at WSP USA. Her current research area includes studying of pedestrian safety and the impact of autonomous vehicles on long distance trips in Texas. So with that, I'll pass it off to our first speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. Let me just share my screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Maithreyi. So let me just close this. So in this study, we focused on walk distances across the nation by time of day and time of the year. And traffic fatalities are one of the leading causes of death in the United States, and pedestrian deaths continue to rise. The aim of the study is to understand factors that could be attributed to the higher pedestrian fatalities in the United States, and more so in the southern latitudes. So pedestrian deaths, it has been kind of stable per DMT. It increases, but not drastically. But the total number of deaths is still rising, especially in Texas. And numbers per capita also jumps quite a bit. As the total goes up, the population doesn't go up as fast. And we actually did not notice that more people are results don't show that people are walking much more either. And pedestrian deaths as share of total traffic deaths also increases by more than 40%, which is from 12 to 17% in the US and 12 to 19% in Texas. In the US has a much higher walking and cycling fatality rates compared to many other countries in Europe. While Europe has made much greater progress in improving their walking safety over the past decade. People in UK, France, Germany, and Netherlands walk much more than the average American, but the US pedestrian death rates were 5 to 10 times higher per mile walked. This is looking between 2016 and 2018 than those in Western European nations during the same time period. Per capita pedestrian death rates rose 19% between 2010 and 2018 in the US, while the UK recorded a 4% increase. During the same period, other European countries like Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany saw a significant decline. So this brings up the question that what are we doing wrong? Since both countries have access to similar technology, one important difference might be the land use pattern. US developed after the age of automobiles, which has drastically shaped the cities here. Now, focusing more on the US, walking makes up 10.5% of US person trips, while walking distances are just under 1% of Americans' person miles traveled, PMT. And pedestrian fatalities make up 70% of all US roadway deaths, and this number continues to rise. So this makes walking way more dangerous than driving, just looking on a per mile basis. And walking per household just rose 6.5% between 2001 and 2017. while pedestrian death rates rose over 40%, which is 12% to 16%. Sorry, 30%, 12% to 16%. And a lot of those deaths that are rising up is really in darkness, which is really interesting because Americans don't really walk as much at night. And light conditions and time of day, particularly evenings and late nights, not only has high number of pedestrian crashes, but also the severity of pedestrian injuries is greater. And roughly 76% of US pedestrian deaths occur before sunrise and after sunset. That's nighttime. And looking at the figure here, between 2010 and 2019, daylight pedestrian fatalities increased by about 16%, but there was a significant jump in pedestrian fatalities during darkness, which increased by about 54%. And looking at pedestrian deaths across the country, per the Governor's Highway Safety Association's 2019 study, 5 states, Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas, all relatively southern states, accounted for almost half, that's 47% of all pedestrian deaths during the first 6 months of the study. By comparison, these 5 states represented approximately 33% of the US population in the same year. And on the right side, we have a snippet from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's 2019 summary of pedestrian fatalities, and it shows that the pedestrian fatality rates per 100,000 population, and the ones marked in red are the problematic areas. And from this figure, it's quite evident that it's concentrated in the southern latitudes. And on the left, we have a map which shows the top 15, which are shown in dark blue, states with highest pedestrian fatality rates per capita. And there's it's clearly all in the southern latitudes, and it's roughly below 37-degree latitude. And looking at all this, southern states usually lead in pedestrian fatalities. And this was one of the major motivators for the study. So the study examines various demographic, location, position, time of day, day of year and day of year attributes that characterize Americans' walk miles traveled, or WMT. So here we look at the National Household Travel Survey data, and this is weighted. This is a weighted average based on the population expansion in the NHTS. On the top, we look at the average daily WMT by month for different trip origin location categories. So the origin, the latitudes are split from 25-degree latitude, which is Hawaii, to above 50-degree latitude, which is Alaska, and in between it's separated in 5-degree bins. And here Hawaii looks really good in terms of walking. So does the 40 to 45-degree latitude. And looking at average daily miles, walk miles per person by day of week, Monday and Thursday are bigger walk days, and generally weekdays see more walking than weekends, and on average by 20%. So the data source used for the study is the 2016-2017 National Household Travel Survey, and this contains almost 924,000 trips made by nearly 130,000 households and 264,000 persons. And this survey was collected from mid-April 2016 through end of April 2017. And in this sample, only 15% of the respondents made a walk trip on the survey day, and about 0.4% made a walk trip at night. And in the study, we capped walk distances at 3 miles to avoid any skewing due to trip distances that are misreported to the survey team, or to avoid very long hikes or runs that are typically anyway away from roadways. And the figure on the bottom looks at average WMT, person WMT by trip origin latitude and by month. And Hawaii is up in summer and late fall. Alaska also sees a jump in the summer and also in December. So on comparing average person WMT by month, for walk trips in the northern and southern settings. I mean, we split northern and southern regions by 40-degree latitudes, since that approximately passes through the center of the continental US. The average WMT ranges between 0.15 to 0.3 per person, and it's generally highest in the summers in the northern states, and higher in the winters in the southern states. And only in January does the average American in the southern US state walk more than those in northern states. And so length of daylight on the survey day in the survey location was important for this study, since a lot of pedestrian crashes occur in darkness. Darkness, and we used a Python library called Suntime to find the sunrise and sunset times for each trip origin. And here we compare the proportion of walk miles at daytime and night by different trip origin latitudes and by seasons. And almost 30% of the walking in Alaska was at night. And surprisingly, winter and fall seasons saw more walking at night as compared to other months. So here we used Stata statistical software for modeling, and we estimated two models, which is WMT per day per respondent and WMT per day per respondent at night on the survey day. And we used hurdle regression models to estimate this. Due to the high, this model seemed appropriate due to the high number of zero distance observations in the data set. And also hurdle regression can reflect both the discrete decision to walk and the continuous distance decision. So here on this slide, we have the first part of the first model. This is over 2 pages just to fit all the variables in. So here we have the selection model, which is a logistic model to determine if the person will walk or not. And then we have the exponential regression part for the on the next page for WMT per person per day. So here we have the +1 SD effect, which is the +1 standard deviation effect, which looks at the practical significance of a variable. And it shows the impact on WMT with a 1 standard deviation increase in each independent variable. So results from the study indicate that younger people or people of non-white race and of lower income or with college degrees are more likely to take a walk on the survey day. And non-working, more educated males are generally walking longer distances on average. And a person's resident state and demographic characteristics, such as education level or age, has stronger effects on WMT than their trip origin, latitude, or seasonal effects. Interestingly, gender was not important for whether a person makes a walk trip, but looking at the exponential part of the model, males walk about 10% more per day once they decide to walk, with a 1 standard deviation increase in the indicator variable. Another education level was another variable that was practically very significant. So increasing the bachelor's and graduate degree indicator variables by 1 standard deviation increases the daily WMT predictions by 38 and 49% respectively. Also, age is another variable that was practically very significant. Increasing it by 1 standard deviation decreases the WMT prediction by almost 40%. And a person's resident state for some states were also practically significant. Georgia, California, South Carolina, Wisconsin, Texas, residents walk about 30 to 60% less miles per day with a standard deviation increase. Another variable that was practically significant was length of daylight, which also shows an increase with 1 standard deviation increase. Now, looking at the second model, here we estimate the nighttime WMT per person per day. There's a higher chance of making a nighttime walk trip on the survey day if the person has a college degree, is male, African American, worker, and or of lower household income. And the second exponential regression, estimating those nighttime walk distances, indicate similar trends as the previous model. you can see that bachelor and graduate degrees are still practically very significant, and for nighttime WMT. Similarly, Texas and Wisconsin resident indicator variables are also practically very significant. So another thing we looked at was we divided the pedestrian fatalities by the WMT for each state's resident population. And this places all southern states in the top 10 most deadly states, with Alabama and Mississippi topping the list. And higher ranking states are all concentrated in the southern latitude. So from these model results, the mystery why pedestrian death rates are so high at night or in southern state is not very clear. And model results do not suggest that more nighttime walking is responsible for higher pedestrian fatalities in the southern region. So we looked at some more metrics, and here the ones that are highlighted in red are considered northern states, or they're above 40-degree, major portion of that state is above 40-degree latitude, and the orange are considered southern states. So here the first column is WMT per person per day, and majority of them are northern states. And the next 4 columns, which are all pedestrian fatality metrics, are pretty much all southern states. And neither traffic fatality rates due to alcohol consumption nor overall alcohol consumption per capita support this result. So it seems like differences in built environment and other car-centric cultures of these southern states might be playing a role for their high pedestrian fatality count or rates. And southern latitude states also lead in crash deaths. So the model's findings suggest that in addition to demographic and geographic factors, which I mentioned earlier, other factors such as lack of enforcement, poor design of road infrastructure, weak licensing laws, and driver culture may contribute to these higher pedestrian fatality rates, which are observed in many of these southern states, and they should be further examined. And these systemic issues can significantly impact the safety of pedestrians and all other travelers on the road. So that's it I have for now. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very informative. So we have 2 questions. Do you have any advice as to how we could best integrate safety data into our travel demand models?
Travel demand models. Okay, so that's, do you mean travel demand models or regression models? Or,
it says travel demand models in the question, but if Guy could maybe elaborate, that might be helpful. And in the meantime, maybe you could answer the question as to what WMT is again for someone who joined late.
Oh, sorry. WMT is walk miles traveled. So it's similar to VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, but this is just in terms of walking.
Great, thanks so much.
Answers. And I guess safety data and travel demand models, I might not have the best answer, but in regression models, I guess another thing we want to add is built variables regarding built environment, or it could even be based on, I guess, crosswalk information, or I guess if there are, if there's, I guess if the environment around is transit friendly, or I guess bike and walk friendly, these could give more insight on where these crashes happen. I wouldn't specifically say that's safety data, but it could give a better idea on, give a better picture on safety.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your informative presentation. And again, feel free, audience members, if you don't have time to answer your question or want to pull into more conversations, please reach out to our speakers. We want to continue these important conversations. So thank you so much. And we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So our second presentation is entitled From State of the Practice to State of the Art, Improving Equity Analysis in Regional Transportation Plans. Maxwell Cabello, who was our presenter today, is currently a PhD student in the Urban Planning and Public Policy Department at the University of California, Irvine, and holds a Master's of City Planning degree from Pratt Institute. His research is focused on the relationship between public policy and ethno-racial and spatial inequality, with a particular focus on housing policy. And with that, I will pass it off to Maxwell to share his screen and get us moving on his presentation. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction. Like Dr. Ryan mentioned, I'm Maxwell. And I'm presenting this paper that we've submitted for publication. So like she mentioned, the focus is on regional transportation plans. This is a brief agenda.
I apologize. Sorry. I think your presentations are in the opposite mode because we can see many of your slides right now.
Oh, really?
Yep. If you have two screens, this can sometimes happen. Or if you just want to make sure you're sharing the other part of your screen if you're already in presenter mode.
I think you might have to go on the slideshow tab to unclick slideshow there. Yeah.
Is it still showing?
You might have to reshare your screen.
Okay, I'll stop and try to reshare.
That works.
Okay, we'll just do it from here. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that looks good. Thanks.
Okay. I don't know if it's capturing my shift though. Okay, I'm just gonna leave it like this. Okay, sorry about that. So the two research questions guiding this paper are essentially what are the current practices in equity planning and analysis in RTPs? So what are MPOs currently doing when they do their equity analysis? And then the second piece is what practical steps can they take to improve upon those equity analyses? So the rest of the paper will kind of follow that structure. For a quick background, a couple of key terms. So the focus on this paper is largely accessibility. So the way that equities evaluated by MPOs currently is largely focused on accessibility. So we use this definition from Gers and Van Wee just to give clarity to what we're talking about. The other term, population of concern, is kind of an umbrella term we use, and I'll use throughout this presentation, because each MPO, when they talk about groups that they're evaluating equity or impacts on from an equity position, they use a lot of different terminology. Sometimes it's communities of concern, disadvantaged communities. We kind of umbrella term that into populations of concern. So if I mention that, that's just kind of a broad term of some population or a combination of populations that they're looking at impacts to. Another important part of this paper is that the equity analysis is derived from Title VI requirements from the federal government. So in order to receive transportation funding, MPOs need to include an equity analysis in their annual RTP. And there's specific guidelines from the Federal Transit Administration that was last updated in 2012. So there's specific things they have to do in order to get funding. So that necessitates this equity analysis that is in RTPs. In terms of where we started, we wanted to kind of develop a framework for our analysis. So we looked at kind of current research and understanding of how MPOs are doing equity analyses. And we bucketed that into these three different areas. So the first one is MPOs where they aren't using travel forecasting. So essentially here, I'm jumping a little ahead into our analysis, but typically this entails mapping where populations of concern are in a given region and overlaying that with investments. So a quick example here is the New York MPO. This map on the left is showing where low income and minority communities exist in the region. And then they overlaid where those regions are with investments from the RTP. So the map on the left, the gray cross-hatching is where it's low income and minority communities. And then the blue lines and red dots are showing where investments are coming from the RTP. So the point here is to show those communities are getting access to investments, and that's proving non-discrimination. That's kind of the lowest tier of when there's no forecasting done. And that has two main limitations. One, it's only showing where investments are occurring. So evaluating inputs instead of understanding actual outcomes that's happening in those communities. And so one example we point out in our paper is a lane widening project in a low-income community may not actually have positive impacts to that community if, for example, there's low car ownership or different travel behaviors that are causing them not to get benefit from that specific investment. The other piece is that the way they're looking at disadvantaged communities or populations of concern is purely geographical. So if you, in that last example, if you're a low-income household or a minority household living outside of the specific geographies I identified, they're not really assessing your impact from the RTP. So it's hard to know what those families' impacts are in terms of from an equity perspective. The next bucket is doing analyses of trip-based travel demand models. And so here, the unit of analysis is a spatial unit. So outcomes are aggregated at a spatial level, typically a TAZ, could be a census tract, but it's some kind of geospatial unit. And the usefulness of this modeling is that it does forecast outcomes. So even though they're done in a spatial unit, that does actually derive like some kind of results that can look at what's happening because of the RTP. But the two main issues I want to kind of highlight in the last two bullet points is it's unable to look at distribution of benefits and harms across different groups because they're aggregated at that spatial level. So if you want to know what's happening to low-income families, you can only really look at what's happening in those geographic zones where they're concentrated. It's a lot harder to understand how they're specifically impacted because if a TAZ or census tract is 50% low income, it's hard to know how the impacts to that zone are split up amongst the different groups there. And that's important because assessing equity at this level can obscure the systematic differences in travel behavior, which previous researchers have outlined that even controlling, for example, for income level and stuff like that, there's groups behave in certain different ways, and that would be obscured in this method. The last one I'm going to highlight is activity-based travel demand models. This gets past a lot of the issues of the previous two models or approaches, where the output is actually person-level results. And it also considers different individual and household decisions and behaviors. So it's a lot more dynamic and allows the model to forecast impacts from policies and projects more accurately and in ways that the other models can't. And an important component of this for what we're discussing in our paper is that those person-level results also allow you to look at the distribution of benefits within and across populations of concern. So again, if your focus is on how low-income households are impacted by the proposals in a regional transportation plan, this will output individual results so that you can look at what's happening to them both collectively and distributed across that group. So are all the benefits within that low-income population concentrated into one subsection of it, or is it equally distributed? And that's not clear in the other models. So we also lean on the state-of-the-art framework for equity analysis that's been proposed by Bills and Walker. It involves 4 steps. The first one is pretty straightforward. A lot of MPOs are already doing this, which is to identify which populations you're interested in assessing equity for and what indicators you want to measure. The second piece is measuring those indicators using travel model data. The third is comparing distributions rather than means. And so that's where the activity-based modeling is important, is because you need individual outputs or like user level outputs to compare distributions. And then lastly, evaluating those scenarios based on a certain equity criteria. And this is also important because it's hard to understand how to interpret the results if you don't have a set equity criteria. And for that piece, we lean on this equity ladder that Martins and Golub developed a couple years ago. And the lowest rung of the ladder is non-discrimination, which is self-explanatory. Basically, no group is explicitly being discriminated against. Pareto looks for some amount of benefit for some groups while not harming anybody else. Pareto Plus is not harming any group and making sure all groups receive some benefits. Proportional equity, everybody gets the same share of benefits. And then restorative equalization is kind of the highest standard, where it actually looks at past behaviors and investments and tries to make sure that groups that have been marginalized in the past get a greater share of benefits. So in terms of our methodology for our analysis, we pulled in a lot of these background things I just discussed to frame our content analysis of RTPs from 11 large MPOs. Following past researchers, we assume that the largest MPOs will have the most advanced equity analyses. Obviously, there could be exceptions to that, but we figured they have the most advanced modeling capabilities and staffing and access to resources. So these are some of the dimensions we did our content analysis on. One was the equity standard. So that latter I just mentioned, we specifically looked at the equity metrics and the goals that they had tied to those. So if, for example, they were looking at populations of concern versus the rest of the region in vehicle miles traveled, if they're trying to have a reduction of the same amount, that would be proportional equity. If they were trying to provide more benefit for the population of concern, that would be kind of a restorative equalization standard. Next was how they define populations of concern. So whether it was geographies where they were concentrated or a user base. So whether or not it was like, for example, areas where low-income families are concentrated or low-income families across the region. So those definitions were important based on what I talked about before. And then when I say the role of equity analysis in RTP, it's just how integrated it was into the broader plan. Some people have one appendix with it and it's kind of siloed there. Other places it's referred to throughout their documents and plan. And then we also looked at community engagement, if outside community groups helped with the analysis or choosing metrics. And lastly, legal compliance. So did it exceed the Title VI requirements or did it just meet them? So this is the list of all the RTPs and MPOs we were looking at, as well as the supplementary documents, because if the RTP was mentioning something else or if the equity analysis was housed somewhere else, we kind of hunted down all the places that might be in their documents. So this kind of outlines everything that was reviewed. And then jumping into our findings, I kind of framed this in two chunks to follow the research questions. So what is the range of the state of the practice? We kind of find these like three distinct buckets from the MPOs that we looked at least in our sample. So the first group is those that meet the legal requirement standard. Typically these ones are doing essentially what I showed up front with the New York City MPO. They're mapping where the populations of concern live and then overlaying investments on there. There's not a lot of clarity in terms of what their equity standards are because they don't really have metrics or targets. So these ones are a little squishier, I guess. It's pretty much that mapping exercise to try to prove there's no discrimination. The second group is kind of the largest chunk of MPOs in our analysis, which use what we say they're the ones that use conventional accessibility metrics. This seems to like exceed the bare minimum from the first group, but still relies on primary threshold and location-based analysis. So essentially they're looking at geographies where population of concern is over a certain threshold and analyzing those locations compared to areas outside those locations. And here we see a common cluster of accessibility metrics, often looking at average commute times, access to parks, hospitals, jobs, schools, shopping, and stuff like that. The equity standards were pretty mixed here as well, ranged from non-discrimination to proportional equity. And the last group we kind of describe as those that are doing cutting edge analyses. These ones are looking, instead of the threshold and location-based, are usually using activity-based models and getting person-level outputs and looking at the populations, like the populations of concern across the region, not just in specific geographies. And they, while also using the same kind of common accessibility metrics, they also use cost metrics like benefit cost ratio, housing and transportation costs, and other metrics like that that seem to be possible with an activity-based model. And here, while they also use a mixture of equity language, a lot of it leans more towards proportional restorative equalization. So the threshold seems higher. One of the important things though is like if you looked at the MPOs in the bottom that were in those classifications, those are pretty all California MPOs, but there are state laws that dictate what they have to do in their equity analysis that goes beyond the federal guidelines. So that's probably a driver of this. And only 3 MPOs in our sample were using their activity-based models for their equity analysis, even though some beyond that did have activity-based models at their disposal. The second group of results is like, how do we actually move towards state of the art? So what are the recommendations given this typology that we identified? So the first group is pretty standard, is that like without forecasting, it's hard to know what impacts are. We're only looking at investments. So the recommendation is largely to move towards using travel demand models to forecast. A lot of the MPOs that did not use their travel demand model for equity analysis actually have one at their disposal. So like in our sample, at least, this seems to be a palatable and possible recommendation. Other rural MPOs might have more restrictions, but in our sample, seems like an easy low-hanging fruit. The second group, those that were using trip-based models, there's different quality and depth that's done with the trip-based model. I think the LA MPO provides a really good example where they were able to do cutting-edge analysis with the trip-based model because they looked at a lot of different population segments and different types of geography and got as thorough as they can. Even though their data is obviously aggregated at a geographic level, it was still cut in different ways to try to understand how those different groups were impacted differently, potentially. And then lastly, earlier I showed that four-step state-of-the-art framework. I think those that are doing activity-based models still are not comparing distributional impacts. They were still using mean outputs when they aggregated those groups of whatever their populations of concern were. So looking at distributional impacts is something that we didn't really see in any of the RTPs, and that would be a big step forward for those groups. So to be cognizant of time, I'll kind of jump forward. Those federal transit guidelines that I mentioned before are being reviewed. So we view this as an opportunity to kind of implement some of those recommendations, particularly making sure MPOs are using their travel demand models in their analysis. And the last piece I'll say before I close is we did focus on accessibility metrics. So when it comes to traffic violence or emissions, that was kind of outside the scope. Those are also very important metrics for equity that should be considered, but that was not the focus of our analysis. So I'll open up to questions if there's any.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maxwell. We have a couple more minutes for questions. If anyone has any, please put them in the chat. I'll start with one brief one. So you mentioned certainly this is based in the United States. From your understanding, given this is a very international conference, how do you see this informing the international landscape beyond the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think the methods are still largely applicable. In our paper, we kind of point to a couple international case studies where activity-based models are being used for problems like congestion pricing in London. I think Sweden and a couple other countries are using activity-based models, but the nuance of its ability to understand policy, look at the impacts of policy things, and I think particularly looking at the distributional impacts is important regardless of the context. So our benefits focused, even within specific groups, focused to certain people within those groups. I think it has broad applicability because we have this Title VI requirement in the US. It gave us a large group of samples to look at how they're doing that. But I think the implications are similar across a lot of countries. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I absolutely agree. I think a lot of these are similar conversations we're having across the board as well, which is really important. So it looks like we don't have any other questions. We're up on time. So thank you so much, Maxwell, and looking forward to continuing the conversation on that important work. All right. So our next speaker will be presenting an e-scooter route assignment framework to improve user safety, comfort, and compliance with city rules and regulations. Myriam Zakhem is a PhD candidate at Southern Methodist University. Her doctoral studies are in the transportation field, and her major focus is on analyzing new transportation technologies in personal mobility, including e-scooters. Her research uses multiple data sources to assess infrastructure conditions and quality and quantity, and develops decision-making tools to guide solutions for infrastructure improvements and related mobility challenges faced by cities. So with that, I'll pass it off to let Myriam present their work. And I believe we may have a recording for this one that may be set up.
Yeah, I'll just be playing that recording right now.
Perfect, thanks so much.
Hi everyone, I am Myriam Zakhem. I am a PhD candidate in civil engineering and a research assistant for Dr. Janil Smith-Collin at Southern Methodist University. Today I will be presenting my work entitled Assigning Safe, Comfortable and Convenient Trajectories for E-Scooter Users, a route assignment framework to improve compliance with rules and regulation. So let's start. This presentation is organized as follows. First, the introduction will introduce shared micromobility systems and the research motivation. Then, the research approach and contribution will be presented. Next, the methodological framework will be detailed. Then, the application of the framework and the result of a set of experiments will be presented. Finally, concluding remarks and possible research extension will be discussed. So shared micromobility systems, notably e-scooters, have grown in popularities in cities worldwide. The rapid expansion of dockless micromobility systems presents major opportunities and challenges for cities, leading some to ban these services within their jurisdictions. Suspending dockless shared micromobility systems has been a significant loss for dockless e-scooter users and cities. This paper introduces the micromobility guidance tool developed to assign safe, comfortable, and compliant routes and to assign the nearest parking locations. The effectiveness of this tool is tested using e-scooter trips completed in Dallas, Texas. This study is among the first to present a tool to advance guidance for shared micromobility users, prioritizing safety, convenience, and adherence to ordinances. The research methodology includes the following steps: identifying the problem case, identifying origin and destination zones, assigning the nearest parking, route the trip across the graph. These steps are further detailed in the following slides. This methodology supports two different problem cases representing two types of user or trip data types. The first case is where the origin point and destination point are known, where users search for the exact destination location. For example, a tourist visiting a new city searches for the exact location of the destination and follows the instruction to begin the trip. The second case is where the origin point and destination zones are known, where users select the destination zone instead of searching for the exact location. For example, when a user knows the city and does not have a desire to or the time to search for the destination location, thus the user approximates the location of the destination to the nearest zone and proceed with the trip. First, the origin destination zones should be identified. In case 1, at the trip origin and destination points are known, so we associate these coordinates with the zones. The zone that contains the origin point is called origin zone, and the one that contains the destination point is called destination zone. In case 2, the destination zone is already provided and thus known, and the origin zone is identified similar to the case 1. After identifying origin and destination zones, the origin and destination should be associated with the nearest network nodes within these zones using the Euclidean distance. This process is called map matching. And also, the identified destination zones help to identify the nearest parking zones. First, all parking locations within the destination zone are identified. Then, for case 1, the user destination is connected to the nearest parking location using the Euclidean distance. In case 2, since there isn't a specific destination, riders will be given information about all parking options within their destination zone so that they can choose the most convenient option for them. In this work, the shortest path algorithm using Dijkstra is applied between the origin and the destination nodes to identify the trip path. We developed a generalized cost function for the network links that estimate the time needed to cross the link while considering for e-scooter accessibility, user route preferences, and city restrictions. The following function is used to compute the time required to travel along link I, where Ti is the travel time assigned to link I in seconds, Li is the link length, in meter. V scooter is the average scooter velocity in meters per second. UI is a binary variable equal to 1 if link I is a restricted road, 0 otherwise. T restricted is a large time penalty. WI is a binary variable equal to 1 when traffic light is available at the link downstream node, 0 otherwise. T crossing is the additional time for crossing a traffic light. Alpha is the factor to account for the type of the infrastructure. And finally, beta is the factor to account for the condition of the infrastructure and the crash locations. To calculate the time required to travel along link I, the value of alpha, beta, UI, and WI need to be identified for each link I. These values were determined using the algorithm illustrated in the flowchart. For each link I, the availability of a bike trail is checked first. Does it contain a bike trail? If the answer is yes, we set alpha equal alpha bike trail. If the answer is no, we check for the availability of a bike lane. If a bike lane is available, we check the condition of the bike lane. If the link I does not have a bike trail or a bike lane, the link is checked for the availability of a sidewalk. The sidewalk condition is also checked to ensure it is not deficient or restricted. In case where sidewalks are restricted, the algorithm checks for the next available infrastructure type on link I. For example, one-way roads or two-way roads. Next, the identified value, alpha, beta, UI, and WI for each link I are inserted into equation 1 to calculate the link cost. The following table presents alpha and beta values. Values for alpha were identified based on Zhang et al. 2021. Different scenarios were used to identify values for beta. These scenarios are further detailed in the sections that follow. Several experiments were carried out to define scenarios for the route guidance tool. A dataset of 29,729 scooter trips completed over 239 days was used to analyze the tool under these different scenarios. This paper simulates 7 distinct scenarios by exploring different alpha and beta values and comparing results to the actual trip trajectories. Before introducing the scenarios, data preparation steps should be conducted to determine the condition and availability of infrastructure elements available on each link. To the network graph, which consists of nodes and links, we add pavement deficiency data, sidewalk deficiency data, restricted sidewalk zones, crash location data, and parking location data. As mentioned before, this paper simulates 7 distinct scenarios by considering different criteria. For example, SP represents the shortest path where neither the type of infrastructure nor the condition of the infrastructure is considered. Scenario 1 accounts for different type of infrastructure. For example, give priority for bike lanes and bike trails, whereas the condition of the infrastructure is disregarded. In scenario 3 and 4, accounts for crash locations and both the type and the condition of the infrastructure, where the bike lane deficiency and roadway deficiency are treated equally, and sidewalk deficiency has higher priority in scenario 3. Scenario 4 and 5 account also for crash locations and both the type and the condition of the infrastructure, where bike lane deficiency is given higher priority than the roadway deficiency, and this priority is higher for scenario 5. Scenario 6 and 7, where bike lane deficiency is disregarded and where only roadway deficiency is considered, and where sidewalk deficiency priority is higher in scenario 6. Scenario performance was evaluated by examining the percentage of improvement in 4 criteria. Improvement in the use of better conditioned infrastructure, improvement in the use of better type of infrastructure, improvement in the use of bike infrastructure, and reduction in violations. The performance of improvement for each scenario is plotted in this figure for the 4 criteria. Next, we plot the percentage of improvement for scenario 3, 4, and 6, as these scenarios were identified as most effective according to the previous figure. Also, scenario 6 shows a low percentage of improvement for criteria 1, infrastructure condition. It has the highest percentage of improvement in criteria 2, preferred type of infrastructure, criteria 3, bike infrastructure, and criteria 4, violation reduction, compared to scenario 3 and 4. Thus, scenario 6 is selected for the route guidance tool. Descriptive statistics for duration for the actual paths, shortest paths, and paths generated by the micromobility guidance tool are shown in the following table. We can see that the mean duration for paths generated by the developed tool is 12.32 minutes, less than the actual trip mean of 13.06 minutes, and larger than the shortest path mean of 11.49 minutes. The following figure shows an e-scooter trip example with known origin, destination, and 3 passes. The actual path in blue, the shortest path in green, and the path suggested by our tool in red. As shown, the path suggested by our tool guide the rider along nearby bike infrastructure. In comparison, the shortest path directs the rider to a route where the preferred infrastructure is a restricted sidewalk. Thus, a violation may result from following the shortest path. Additionally, the path suggested by the tool avoids one crash location, while the shortest path directs the rider on a route with a known crash history. Therefore, the proposed route is safer, shorter, and more convenient than the actual path, as the latter takes the rider along a route with restricted sidewalk and two-way roads. At the end, the nearest parking location to destination point is assigned to the rider. To sum up, the proposed tool provides route guidance for e-scooter users, taking into account safety, preferred infrastructure and condition, and compliance, and also assign the nearest parking location for riders. The proposed tool can be integrated into existing shared micromobility platforms and applications. Future work may consider adding further characteristics such as riding time and traffic volume, and also create an incentive program for micromobility users to encourage compliance with route and parking guidelines. Thank you everyone for your time and attention, and now I will take any question you have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I believe we are all set and open for questions. As Myriam is on right now. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. And Myriam, if you want to add anything kind of in the moment, now that we have you and we heard your presentation, if there's anything you wanted to share in addition, feel free to hop on and do that now.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you everyone for watching my video, and I'm ready to answer any question you have. Feel free to reach out to me using my email or the chat. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And just I can start with one brief question. Kind of where do you see this going in the next year of your research? What's that immediate next step that you're really excited about? Or are you kind of wrapping this up right now?
Yeah, now like the paper is like under review in a good journal. So yeah, but I see like this tool is really beneficial, and it can help the city to and even the e-scooter providers to introduce a safer like a transportation mode. Because like for example on April 1st 2023 Paris like banned e-scooters. Why? Because tourists often do not know the rules and regulation, where to ride and where to park these e-scooters. So this tool will guide users So, and will improve their behavior while using these services. So I feel like this tool could be a beneficial tool to be integrated into like the providers like Limebird and all the other providers of micromobility services application, which will help a lot, I believe that.
Fantastic. Yes, I agree. And I hope they listen to the work and take it into consideration in their planning. So thank you so much for your time. And folks, again, feel free to reach out to all of our speakers to continue these important conversations, especially if any of your work has to do with any of this moving forward in the future. So with that, I'll move on to our fourth speaker. So our fourth presentation is on rural mobility and the impacts of auto-oriented infrastructure in Appalachia. So Mimi Hutchinson is a transportation planner and researcher based in Illinois, United States. Her work focuses on transportation policy, the margins of mobility, and intersections with health, aging, and disability. And with that, I'll pass it off to Mimi to start her presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. And slideshow. Okay, so today I will be talking about rural mobility and the impacts of auto-oriented infrastructure in Appalachia. So let's start with some historical context. For those of you joining from outside North America, you might be less familiar with Appalachia. It's a region that runs along the eastern portion of the United States surrounding the Appalachian mountain range. As you can see on the map, it's known for its kind of low population density, high density of low-income households. It's also known for being the mecca of the coal industry in the US, and its fight against strip mining. And maybe most recently, you've heard about the grassroots opposition to Joe Manchin's passion project, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So Appalachia is a region where economic, environmental, and social struggles converge. And I really hope this research will be of interest to people studying other rural communities, low-income populations dealing head-on with the impacts of climate change and industrialization, and marginalized communities in general. I think that using Appalachia as a case study really allows us to integrate qualitative research methods with transportation subfields like travel behavior and mobility research, which typically utilize quantitative methods. And lastly, once we get into the policies and projects that have dominated Appalachia's transportation landscape for decades, you'll see that Appalachia is a great case study in analyzing the impacts of auto-oriented mega projects on individual mobility and transit development at a regional scale. So in 1965, the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, was established for the purpose of designing and administering comprehensive plans and programs for the economic and social development of the region. 66% of ARC's total expenditure was dedicated to the construction of the Appalachian Development Highway System, or the ADHS. Construction on the ADHS started off very strong in 1967 with about 7% of all of its planned miles being paved in that year. And then in 1973, as construction began to stall and promises began to get broken, we start to see some critiques of the ADHS in the literature. The first of them being Gautier, who asked the question, development for whom? And since then, about 2,600 miles of the system have been constructed or paved and are now operational, but about 10% has yet to be built. And the estimated cost to completion is about $10 billion. So when we look at reports and other literature coming directly from the ADHS and ARC sources, or the federal government, we can see that the real point of the ADHS was to emphasize the facilitation of exports from key industries, We see phrases like link Appalachia to national interstates and generate economic development. So it's really clear that the ADHS was never about mobility. It was a plan for economic development via highway building. So looking at the stated intent of the ADHS, it becomes clear that it's a highway mega project aimed at bringing economic benefits, and it's a very top-down model. So I want to touch on the logic of mega projects really quickly. One way of defining mega projects is by using the 6 C's. So is the project colossal, costly, captivating, controversial, complex, and laden with control issues? That assessment was developed by Frick in 2005. Another way of defining mega projects is by thinking of them as expensive projects that either aim or claim to have collective benefits and also expand frontiers. So I've listed some examples there. And there's just been a lot of theorizing about mega projects and how to define them over the past couple decades. And the ADHS fits into pretty much every available definition. So with all projects of such a large scale, there are always limitations, exceptions, and blunders. So all of this is to say that this research project is really about the limitations, exceptions, and blunders of the ADHS when we view it as a mega project. And what I hope to accomplish with this research is an assessment of the way mega projects, intentionally or not, impact mobility. I hope to question the lasting credibility of the ADHS and open a door for researchers to use this as a case study in their explorations of similar and more recent projects and policies. I also hope to present a methodology for mobility researchers who are studying places where data might be limited. And lastly, I hope to provide relevant recommendations for transit agencies in rural areas. So how was this research carried out? First, I conducted a literature review to find out what preliminary conclusions we can make about the characteristics of mobility in rural areas. So I probed the literature for signs that those characteristics might have been brought on in whole or in part by the ADHS. And with those conclusions under my belt, I was then able to craft an informed questionnaire and conduct interviews with practitioners that were local to the region. And in those interviews, I tried to establish how their transit agencies are responding to the current mobility landscape. And I also asked interviewees what they think about the ADHS and what they see as the role of public transit in rural areas. So moving into the literature review findings now, when I explored the literature, it reaffirmed the understanding that planning for the ADHS was predicated on the idea that an extensive highway system would kind of spawn top-down economic development by ramping up key regional industries like mining and logging. So Gautier in 1973, which was less than a decade into construction, concluded that the ADHS increases rather than decreases regional inequalities. And then much later in 2008, Line and Day described the ADHS as a system of induced growth. And there's a long description of that system here if you care to read over the slides later. And in addition to the more theoretical critiques of the ADHS, there has also been a handful of quantitative measurements of its impacts. So here's a handful here. In 1995, a large study combined qualitative data from interviews with on-the-ground observation and then quantitative data about human services, and found that human and social services funding for the region was actually more integral to economic development than the highway construction itself. And then in 2007, Landsat satellite data was used to track changes in land use along one ADHS highway corridor and found that the highway might have been the cause for intensifying land uses, but ultimately failed to address fundamental barriers to work, housing, and health services. And then in 2014, the regional production function model was used to study the ADHS. And this study showed no evidence of increased economic activity among small businesses in counties that were adjacent to ADHS corridors. So among sources that are separate from ARC, the highway system hasn't really lived up to expectations. And that concludes the literature review portion of this research. So next up was getting perspectives from local decision makers and planners. So I was able to craft an interview guide that would help me address my research questions and aims. You can view the full interview guide and transcripts on the Qualitative Data Repository, or QDR. I wanted to reach all kinds of transportation and planning practitioners in Appalachia, so I got in touch with researchers, MPO level planners. If you're outside the US, that's just like a regional planner, agency level transportation planners, city level planners, and transit agency directors. And these were all one-on-one interviews that I conducted. I also made sure to have representation from all 5 subregions of Appalachia, so North, South, Central, etc. I used Atlas TI in combination with the flexible coding approach that was developed by Detterding and Waters. And all of these interviews were conducted in late 2020 and early 2021. So if you look closely at the transcripts, you'll see quite a few notes about the impacts of the pandemic. And if you're interested in that, you can go look for it. But I didn't focus on that in this particular project. So following the flexible coding approach, I was able to find the most common themes that interviewees noted during our conversations, and I'll refer to these themes as tags. So some of the tags were derived from an inductive approach where I compiled common threads while reading over the transcripts. One example of an inductive tag is solutions. So several interviewees without provocation mentioned their agency or their region's solutions to certain problems that surfaced in the conversation. And then other tags were the result of direct questions that I asked in the questionnaire. So those tags would be deductive because they're the result of a deductive approach. For example, every interviewee was asked what they think are the barriers to maintaining or expanding transit service in their region. So data from each interviewee is represented in the barriers tag. So going into more detail on the barriers tag, I was really probing for factors that are a hindrance to proper maintenance or expansion of transit services. Among interviewees' answers, the leading subtags were management issues, lack of funding, difficult topography, operations precedents, stigma against transit, aging riders, and economic trends. And then there was a subtag within management issues, because that one was brought up a lot, where interviewees mentioned lack of cooperation between adjoining jurisdictions and the inability to accommodate like cross-county travel because of jurisdictional boundaries and political gridlock. And these are some key quotes that I won't read now. And then this is a more visual depiction of the last slide. So it just shows how the tags and subtags are kind of nested according to the flexible coding approach. Another deductively derived tag was effects, which arose from my question, what have been the effects of the ADHS on public transportation planning in your region? And the purpose of this tag or this question was to get at interviewees' high-level reactions to the ADHS. So then I grouped tags from their answers into positive and negative effects. Among the negative effects were that the ADHS seemed to have led to lots of car dependency in the region, as well as low population density, which made transit more challenging. And among the positive effects were a more connected and integrated economy and the addition of jobs. And the effects reaction breakdown was 69% negative and 31% positive. And these are some quotes that maybe we can get to at the end. Let's see. So I also asked, what do you understand to be the intent of the ADHS? And the point of asking this question was to gauge how this massive and far-reaching mega project is being received by people whose work is directly impacted by it. So even though the intent of the ADHS, when you look at its stated intent, it's pretty clear that it's economic development, it's still kind of interesting to see how the project is interpreted or misinterpreted by transit professionals who are impacted by it. So what I found was that the further an interviewee's kind of agency or service area was located from an economic center, the less likely they were to believe that the intent of the ADHS what like integrated mobility and transit. So there are more quotes at the bottom again. I also asked interviewees to share their ideas about the role of transit in Appalachia and rural areas in general. And the point of this was to highlight the importance of transit and contrast it with the lack of attention that transit was given in the ADHS policy. So most interviewees noted the existence of a significant transit-dependent population in Appalachia and connected this to the role of public transit. Some also mentioned the impact that transit can have on economic development and hinting that maybe transit-centered or transit-first economic development would be more effective than what the ADHS offers, which is very top-down. More quotes. And then finally, something that arose inductively was solutions to all the problems that have been caused by the ADHS. The most common subtags within solutions were technology, deviated fixed route, centralization, partnerships, informal transit, and infrastructure salvaging. So there isn't time to read all of these quotes, but if you're interested, I really encourage you to look at them. Look at the slides later. When I looked over the interviews and saw all the inductive mentions of solutions, it really stood out that technology and informality were being utilized by transit agencies to solve problems. So interviewees noted how technology, particularly auto scheduling systems, have been making operations more efficient and allowing more folks to secure rides. Also, apps and tools for carpool matching that in some cases were developed by the transit agencies were helping people fill in the gaps that were left by public transit. And then informal transit, which in one case referred to people utilizing old gravel turnoffs as carpool meeting points, was another big subtag under solutions. And one researcher I talked to also mentioned some explorations of how informal transit is structured in Appalachia. So they've been carrying out that research and looking at how to better support it. So that concludes my summary of the interview data. We can move on to the takeaways from this research. So first, we can conclude that the ADHS largely disregarded transit and individual mobility, and previous research had already established this. But what I really drilled into with this project was the idea that the ADHS has negatively impacted transit development, which particularly disadvantaged people who are transit dependent. Intentional or not, this was an oversight, a huge oversight, and we can't keep doing economic development at the expense of transit and mobility. I also found a reproducible way to combine historical analysis with interview data. So this is a viable methodology for studying mobility characteristics in rural areas and places that might have a lack of quantitative data available. And then lastly, I identified some proven solutions to the problem of transit in rural and car-centric areas. So leverage technology, support informal transit, and forge collaborations with neighboring agencies. And then here's my contact info. I want to mention that I am looking for doctoral programs and full-time work in transit research or policy. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mimi. So I'll start off with our first question, and then please, folks, please put your questions in the chat for Mimi. So I do find that collaborations, and that's so important, those kind of the network of folks who work on this stuff throughout a region, how they communicate with each other is really important, though it can be really difficult, right? Because there aren't usually a lot of mechanisms for folks to connect, whether it may be through professional organizations, but not everyone's familiar with that. In these conversations, did you notice kind of methods of collaboration that you found folks use to be successful at connecting, especially as political people change throughout regions and things of that nature?
So one example that comes to mind is like a group of counties, I think in the central subregion, had just established their own coalition that was like a standing group that would continue to meet and kind of build institutional knowledge regardless of, you know, who's passing through the agencies. So somebody started out by just getting in contact with the neighboring agencies and neighboring counties and officials, and then established this coalition, established meeting protocols, and then it had been going on for, you know, several years. So I guess that would be my recommendation if somebody was like asking me what to do. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And even you need to have someone really passionate in the first place to form all that, because that's quite a lot of work, but that's great to hear it's happening. We do have a question in the chat. Did you hear any examples of how local regional transportation service providers were able to successfully coordinate with providers of social and human services? What ways could transit providers integrate with or complement informal transit?
That's a great question. Something that comes to mind is like meal delivery, especially in areas with like a high population of older adults or people with disabilities or mobility issues who might not be able to access food. That, you know, if you're able to integrate that into your transit service, that's a really great like human services piece to add. Let's see. I know that like COVID testing during the pandemic also came up, like mobile testing units and utilizing the transit agencies for that. That's what comes to mind right now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Really informative and really different than a lot of other presentations I've seen in the series. So thank you so much. Again, please reach out to Mimi and all of our other presenters if you want to continue the conversation, as we really need to be doing in this area. So I'll move on to our next presentation, which is entitled Patterns of Car Dependency of Metropolitan Areas Worldwide, Learning from the Outliers. So our presentation is going to be by Pedram Saeidizand, who's a PhD researcher at VUB, Free University of Brussels in Belgium. He studies the relationship between urban form and travel behavior with a specific emphasis on car dependency. Their background lies in civil engineering, and they hold a master's degree in urban management and development. Their areas of expertise include public transportation planning, parking management, cycling route design, and new mobility services. And with that, I'll pass it off. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're not yet in presenter. There you are. Yep, all set.
Perfect. Thanks again. And thanks for the introduction. And this is the title of this presentation, Patterns of Car Dependency of Metropolitan Areas Worldwide, Learning from the Outliers. So I'm Pedram Saeidizand, and this paper was co-authored with Cabello, both of us from Cosmopolis Center for Urban Research, VUB, Belgium, Brussels. So this is about car dependency at the level of metropolitan areas. So we focused on outlier and metropolitan areas that sometimes from now I'm going to call them metropolitan areas, sometimes MAs. Obviously, MAs is easier, but when you hear MA, it means metropolitan area. So we focused on those MAs with unexpected, either higher or lower car travel in a collection of global metropolitan areas. This map kind of illustrates the collection of cities studied for this work. I'll tell you a little bit further about this later, but you can see that many cities were studied and from different regions around the world. Of course, more European cities, because in general, when it comes to transport, sustainable transport, Europe has many things to say. In order to perform this exploration, we required a proper data source to base our analysis on. And this database was Mobility in Cities Database, MCD, which is a UITP publication and was used for this research. UITP is actually International Association of Public Transport, also based in, it's a private company based in Brussels, Belgium. So MCD is a quite unique and special data set. I'm not aware of any other data set which offers such a data in global level on cities in relation to their different aspects of their mobility, also some other data. It includes data, as I mentioned, on different aspects of urban mobility in 56 global MAs, both developed and developing, and as I said, from different regions. And it was tried to cover different parts of the world as much as possible. Of course, there was also some limitations. MCD also shows some data on built environment and social demographic variables of metropolitan areas. Well, you can imagine the kind of data that could be available at the level of metropolitan areas when it comes to built environment, social demographic ones. So I refer to car dependency, but obviously there should be a variable that reflects this car dependency and is measurable at in the meantime. So car modal share was considered for this. And in order to identify the correlation between car modal share and included variables in different MAs, a modeling exercise was done by availing of MCD and employing OLS regression as the modeling tool. 6 variables consisting of urban density, public transport journeys per capita, public transport kilometers of service per capita, gasoline price, car ownership, and congestion index turn out to be significant as the result of this modeling exercise, considering car modal share as the dependent variable and all other variables, which were way more than 6, as independent variables. So these 6 variables were identified as the significant ones. And the output of this model exactly was used as the basis for recognizing outlier MAs and including them in this study. And just one more thing to mention, a congestion index that you see here was actually the only variable that was not included in MCD. And we actually referred to an external website in order to get data on that for different cities. So the objectives of this study were the following: detecting outlier MAs on the MCD sample through employing a suitable methodology. That was the first objective. Second objective, compiling a catalog of outlier MAs and developing a systematic overview of mobility profiles of these outliers, specifying variables affecting their exceptional nature. Exceptional nature obviously points out the not anticipated level of car use in these MAs. As I mentioned, it could be higher or lower. We'll talk about that later further. So literature review. The literature review that was conducted for this research was actually cover two angles. One related to car dependency, purely technical when it comes to our field, and the other one that I'm going to refer to and talk about later was about outlier detection in general. So starting with car dependency, it is a long-standing issue in almost all regions. I think everybody agrees on that. So a crucial topic to conduct research on. But in general, if you look at the literature, especially academic literature concerning car dependency, you see that the majority of scholars pay attention to individuals or households as units of analysis. They also mainly study car dependency in a single neighborhood, city, or in some cases, country. As opposed to them, a significantly smaller group of researchers regard a collection of cities or MAs in their work. Actually, the line of research that was developed by three scholars, Newman, Laube, and Kemworthy, I believe that at least some of you know one, two, or all of them. What they did served as the foundation of literature on car dependency at the level of cities and its association with specific variables, particularly urban form. So they looked at car dependency. In the first place, they looked at car dependency in cities and how cities are doing in relation to that. And then they tried to link it to the driving forces for that, with a focus on urban form, especially density. However, despite offering interesting results, they never investigated outliers in their studies. And here I'm showing you a famous graph that these three scholars produced. Probably, again, some of you are familiar with that. It was produced by them on correlation between urban density and gasoline consumption by transport sector back in 1980, which is largely still valid today. And it shows that when there is an inverse relationship between urban density and gasoline consumption, which is expected, and the gasoline consumption itself is an indicator of car travel. So as I mentioned, the other aspect of literature review was linked to outlier detection, because we had to find a proper, defendable way to detect outliers in a data set. And because this is not our field, we had to kind of start from the scratch. And this is a special area of focus. As I said, irrespective of the field, studying outliers could provide unique knowledge and crucial information. The thing is that studying outliers, we really believe that studying outliers could be a piece of work on its own, which is not necessarily seen, noticed by all researchers like that. And yeah, in many cases, when it comes to outliers, people just want to make sure that they are out of the data set because they believe that they distort observation, they affect the result of analysis negatively, and that's why they are normally seen like that and they're dealt with like that. Numerous methods have been introduced on discovering outliers in any data set, and Mahalanobis distance is one of them, which has been recommended by many scholars according to what we found in the literature. And we came to the conclusion that we want to use this method for identifying outlier for this study as well. And this is the Mahalanobis distance formula. I'll try to quickly refer to different components of this formula, this equation. X minus mu represent the difference between the point X and the mean mu. S powered by -1 is the inverse of a covariance matrix S, and X minus mu powered by T denotes the transpose of the vector X minus mu. Okay. So we used this Mahalanobis distance as the tool for discovering outlier MAs, and we came up with this list of cities as the outlier, I should say metropolitan areas, because the definition is not necessarily the same and they probably shouldn't be necessarily used interchangeably. So MAs, metropolitan areas, 7 MAs, as you can see again from different regions. For example, Berlin with a Mahalanobis distance 1.2, Dubai from Middle East 28.1. Other MAs are the following: Dublin, Johannesburg, Phoenix, Oslo, Rome. One of the interesting things about this list is that it is really diverse, but it was just a result of the modeling exercise, interestingly. So now we identified, and I already introduced outlier MAs. So the other main task as the second objective of this study was developing mobility profiles. And the main purpose of developing these mobility profiles was indicating the major driving forces of abnormal car use in these MAs. Therefore, every mobility profile showcases a range of variables contributing to car dependency and their status in different metropolitan areas, which were categorized under the following groups: 1, urban form; 2, convenience of car use; 3, availability and use of public transport; 4, availability and use of other alternative modes; and 5, car ownership. So how were the mobility profiles developed? It was important that we have a proper method and we stick to it for all MAs, at least as a matter of consistency. So a systematic method was considered for this, for collecting, supporting information on every MA's car dependency. Different sources of information were consulted by implementing this, important by implementing a hierarchical classification, which means that initially we referred to 3 major sources: Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. And then, as the next layer of sources, we relied on regional and local governments' publications in each MA. And lastly, we referred to prominent media and news websites, in some cases, in many cases, local news websites. And when this was the case, because the source was not as prominent as others, we made sure that it is valid, the information offered is valid, and the information was cross-verified. So I am going to refer to the major findings of this study. Assessing mobility profiles made it clear that in all outlier MAs, in all of them, a combination of different variables affected car dependency, and not just a specific variable, which means that it wasn't like, for example, that only density or only public transport journeys per capita, or even only a pair of them cause that unpredicted level of car traffic in a city that led them to be an outlier in a collection of MAs. Focusing on each variable one by one, public transport availability and use was observed as a driving force in all 7 outlier MAs. Urban form, especially density, was placed after that. Its impact was observed in 6 MAs. And car ownership, as expected, with a proven association with car traffic in 5 MAs, came next. Of course, we don't believe that car ownership necessarily means car use. There are many examples of that, but it is also difficult to deny that car ownership really influences the level of car use in any region. As presented, we discovered sufficient evidence for these MAs to be outliers. There are many documents, publications, there's lots of information that confirms actually these MAs are the outlier ones, and confirms why such an abnormal behavior in relation to car use is observed in these cities. However, we shouldn't also forget that part of the reason for having such a list and not a different one was the model used and its limitations. A remarkable limitation of this model was that it could not capture the non-linear relationship existing between certain variables and car use. It is about the type of relationship that a tool like OLS cannot capture, a type of relationship that can be seen between one of or two or three of the independent variables like car ownership, like public transport, kilometers of service per capita, or any of them, and car use, car modal share in this case, as the dependent variable. It's also crucial to note that another challenge that we faced was that generally comparing MAs is challenging due to geographical, cultural, political, and economic variations. Moreover, discrepancies in the availability of reliable data on mobility plays a part in this regard. Not all relevant data on all variables are equally available for all MAs. It is a function of many factors, for example, being developed or not, caring about regular regular traffic studies to be conducted, or the level of advancement of sustainable transport modes, and in general mobility in a city or in a metropolitan areas. These are all some factors can play a part when it comes to this topic. So concerning the limitations of the research, this research actually faced two major limitations, should be noted. Nature of this type of research, what type of research? The type of research that focuses on cities or metropolitan areas and not people as the units of analysis, does not allow accounting for the influence of crucial variables related to individuals rather than MAs. For example, income, age, attitudes, or lifestyle. There's a great deal of research that proved even more important, stronger impact of these variables on travel behavior in general compared to built environment variables or some others. The other limitation is actually related to the method used for identifying outliers, Mahalanobis distance. I already referred to the fact that it's one of the most popular ones when it comes to identifying outliers, but still there are alternative methods also available. But as mentioned and agreed by many scholars, experts of the field, there's no single method of identifying outliers. But it is important that we pay attention to this as one of the limitations of this research. And at the end, I just want to refer to further research that could be carried out in relation to our study. They could be, metropolitan areas could be approached either individually or collectively. The available data on MAs through MCD could be complemented by detailed social demographic, attitude, and lifestyle related data on every MA. And it makes it possible to do a more exhaustive analysis. And this sort of analysis, especially when it is complemented by some other data linked to some other important variables, may yield more advanced results, which could support urban planners and city authorities in making more effective decisions to promote sustainable transport. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very informative. Unfortunately, we are tight on time to our last presentation, so we don't have time for questions here. However, please reach out to Pedram for future conversations. Your email's listed right there, so thank you so much. And also, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat, and we'll still be here to answer them that way as well. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to our final presentation of the day, which is entitled MobilityCoins and Navigating the Complexities of Tradable Credit Schemes. a multimodal and multi-period quantitative approach. So our presenter is Philipp. Having earned a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Stuttgart in 2007, Philipp delved into the industry as a consultant for 5 years. During his tenure, Philipp spearheaded lean projects in indirect environments and excelled as a project management consultant. Embarking on a new academic journey, he began his doctoral studies in mid-2021 at the Technical University of Munich, TUM, aligning his research with the chair of traffic engineering control, developing a management system called the MobilityCoins system. And with that, I'll pass it up to Philipp for our final presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me today. Just quickly share my screen. So you can hear me and see my screen?
Yes, you're all set.
Great. Okay, so thank you again and welcome everyone. I want to show you something about the MobilityCoin system as well as a quantitative approach to kind of size the system. And let's start. So for the beginning, I would like to show you some slides or 2 slides for the MobilityCoin system, just as an introduction to show you what the system is all about and to understand more about the quantitative approach later on. So let's start with the MobilityCoin. So imagine you're a person want to travel from location A to location B, and you have a budget of, let's say, 5,000 MobilityCoins, which is allocated by an agency at the beginning of a period. And now you can decide if you want to walk there. In this case, you would get 2 MobilityCoins. You can ride a bicycle and get 1 MobilityCoin, or you can get there by car, in which case you have to pay 9 MobilityCoins, or for trip chain, you can ride a bicycle as well as taking the tram, for example, and then you have to get charged by the specific amount of that. The prices are based on the externalities cost, and you get charged by means of transport that raise higher externalities, and you get an incentive for active modes actually. And if you choose then one mode, or the trip chain in this case, you will get charged by the respective amount of 4 MobilityCoins, and you end up with your new budget. So that is the mobility part of the MobilityCoin system, but that is just one part. So the mobility part in this green box below. The second part is that you cannot just spend your MobilityCoins in mobility, but you can also trade your coins. So you can exchange the coins in a local currency. So you can trade them and get euros, for example, for the German citizens. Then there is, as I already said, the MobilityCoin agency, the almighty agency that decides on everything, on the initial endowment as well as taxes that get on the trades or something else. And the third part where the users can get active on is the infrastructure crowdfunding part. So they can spend MobilityCoins for local crowdfunding measures, as we call them. So if you, for example, are a student, you ride your bicycle each and every time to the university, and you want to get an upgrade, so to say, for your bicycle lane, then you can spend coins in those crowdfunding measures. And yes, at some point maybe it will get implemented, but then that's not the topic for today. So that is the MobilityCoin system as a little introduction. And today I want to show you something about the quantitative approach to size the MobilityCoin system. And I think most of the time I am modeling the MobilityCoin system for Munich with a mixed complementarity formulation. And at some point I noticed that I need something, a tool or a calculator to calibrate the system for the city of Munich. That's why I come up with this paper at the end, which means that I chose, or as I've kind of found, this passenger kilometer based approach to size the system, just as introductory information, I adapted the new technologies that arise, and which means that, for example, for the mean externalities of some or of all the means of transport that are reflected, they will, for example, for the battery electric vehicle decrease by year, as well as I implemented the expected developments in energy production. That means that, for the same battery electric vehicles, the mean externalities or greenhouse gas emissions, they decrease year by year. So let's talk about the different information a coin carries, so to say. So let's start at the very top. It's clustered for the same features we have in the MobilityCoin system, what I just showed. So the first part is the mobility part. We have information about the mode-specific range of each and every user in the system, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions that this user will generate by using his coins. Then for the second part, we have the mobility coins multiplied by the market price, which is created due to supply and demand of the market. And you get a monetary value for the coins. And the third part, the crowdfunding part, is that you can get, of course, a monetary value, which is for the agency quite interesting because you need to implement those measures you suggest to the people, as well as a user opinion by merely the amount of coins that are spent in those crowdfunding measures. Today, I will focus just on the mobility part, on the first part at the top. And now let's start with the quantity structure. So this is a really static approach. We start from the very left, and you can see that there are coins generated on the one hand due to the allocation of the agency. It means in the very beginning of a period, let's say a month, each and every user of the system gets a specific amount of coins. So usually, for simplicity reasons, we say that it's uniformly distributed. Everyone gets the same amount of coins. And the second bucket, so this is the green box, is the bike incentive. So in addition to the coins that are allocated from the agency, some people, by riding the bike or walking, they generate additional coins. And so you get, take the laser pointer, a total number of coins. And this total number of coins is then spent in mainly the mobility feature, as well as the crowdfunding part. And again, the mobility feature, the coins will be spent in public transportation, as well as motorized individual transport. So the MIT/MEV. And then if you have a look on the externalities caused, in this term, it is the carbon dioxide equivalent, then you get a ratio simply because of the allocation and the externalities caused, you get a ratio between the coin and the externalities. So this is the status quo. And you can calculate this from data we have from the past. And what we can do now is we can forecast the coins as well as the emissions for future scenarios. So this is basically the structure and idea of the quantitative approach. And what we can do now is, so this is on the left side, again, the greenhouse gas emissions that reflects the network demand in the system in percentage kilometers. So the MIT motorized individual transport, public transport, and riding a bicycle, and an equivalent in coins we get after that. So at the end of the status quo analysis, we have the ratio between the coins and the greenhouse gas emissions. Based on that, we can do mainly two things. We can reduce the number of coins. So we can, for example, lower the incentives, or we can lower the initially endowed and allocated coins. But we can also raise the charges on the other hand, which is quite clear. So in this second scenario, you wouldn't get that far with the same amount of coins anymore. And in the future, we can project those trajectories and we can calculate the forecast for the greenhouse gas emissions based on that coins system, based on the scheme. And what we can do as well is we can compare that with greenhouse gas emission targets given from the municipality, respectively the city of Munich in this case. And we can, of course, then can do, for example, calculate the flows or the mode shifts. So we can calculate, for example, how many % of percentage kilometers have to shift from MIT, so from motorized individual transport to public transport, for example, in order to reach those targets that are given from the cities. In return, we get, again, the number of coins, and we can get this as an input value for the next year for the agency of the MobilityCoin system. So let's make an example. The MobilityCoin agency allocates 10,000 coins per month per user into the system. And then based on the status quo data for Munich, we get a ratio of 0.04 coins that equals 1 gram carbon dioxide equivalent. And based on this data and this ratio, we can then, for example, give an incentive for riding the bicycle for 1 coin, riding the bicycle for 1 kilometer. And then based on the status quo, I got the results that the entire generated coins out of incentives would make 0.89% of the share of circulating coins. So 0.89% of the coins plus the riding the bicycle plus the allocated coins from the agency. And that already is a quite good information, because at the very beginning, when we designed the system, we didn't really know about how high the incentives should be, if we can, for example, give incentives for walking as well, because we do not know if that keeps the balance of the system if we give too high incentives, for example. Of course, the system should be a fair, let's say, balance between push and pull mechanisms. So at this one hand, people should get charged for creating or for polluting, and based on the polluter pays principle. But on the other hand, of course, the incentives should pull people to use active modes more frequently. And based on this example, if you then, for example, ride the bicycle for 10 kilometers, you generate 10 coins, which equals, for example, a 1 kilometer car trip. And that already shows that 1 coin per kilometer is a quite high incentive. Now, let's make another pricing example. So let's allocate again 10,000 coins per month per user. Based on the status quo, again, we get a ratio of 0.04 coins for 1 gram carbon dioxide equivalent. And based on the emissions cost in year 2022, which was 3 billion tons in the city of Munich. In this case, we had to raise the price of the coins, or we actually had doubled the price of the coins or the ratio, in order to reach the target emissions in 2030, which is 2.5-ish billion tons carbon dioxide equivalent per year, given by the city of Munich. And then this is the result in a graph. So we have on the x-axis the years from 2022 to 2030. On the y-axis, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the green dotted line are the emission targets that were given by the city of Munich. And I calculated, based on my data, the target percentage kilometer goals of the city of Munich. That is so fractured in public transport and in motorized individual transport. And I already saw that already in the year 2023. I think they meet still the target in 2023, but in 2024, they already surpassed target with those target percentage kilometers, which is, I think not a good information. And then I calculated, as I just showed, the targets based on the MobilityCoin system, and this blue columns they show the raise in the charge. So from 0.04 to 0.08 in the year 2030. Then based on mode shift, so I calculated back and forth, and I got the mode shift of approximately 8% percentage kilometer that has to shift from MIT, so from motorized individual transport to public transport in order to achieve the city targets. That is, I think, another good information to know in order to set the targets or the prices and charges right. And then another quick outlook. So based on that calculator, we've already seen on the left side that the energy tax, so which was formerly the emission fuel tax, it was called, I guess. And this is already declining. So due to new technologies like battery electric vehicles, the income of the municipalities and the cities is already shrinking, because of course the energy tax is generated by fuel, by selling fuel, and this declines in Germany, as we can see here, from 2019 to 2022 already, from 40.7 billion to 33.7 billion. And what we or politicians would like to know is if there is something how to fill that gap that will get even bigger in the future. And we thought about calculating this based on the calculator and the model with the MobilityCoin system, if we can, for example, raise revenue through applying a transaction fee on the MobilityCoins transactions on the MobilityCoin market again. Yes, I think I reduced the slide deck a little bit and it worked pretty well. So I'm already at the end of my presentation and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Philip. We have about 2 minutes if anyone has any specific questions at this time. If not, I may start us off. So in terms of how you see this transitioning in other countries such as Canada and the United States, just from my perspective, do you see it being quite different, or can the same methodology really be accepted?
You mean the MobilityCoin system in total?
Yes. Yep.
So the MobilityCoin system has lots of aspects that are highly welcomed in Germany and others that are not, to be honest. And I think that the system can do a lot. And I think at the same time, the system has lots of challenges that needs to be solved in the future. I mean, data security is one big thing we discuss a lot about, because of course you need to track in some way the trajectories of the people, because you need to know the data and you need to know how they are traveling, and to at the very end set the prices and set the charges, of course, for the users. I think this can work everywhere, basically, in theory. I'm convinced about that. It's a challenge, definitely, to implement something like that. And especially for the quantitative approach, I would be really happy to apply this in different countries as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great point. It all depends on the context and who's willing to work with you on it too. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. And I'll wrap it up. Thank you all so much for everyone's presentations again today. Please reach out to our presenters and continue these important conversations. The topics of equity and accessibility that were discussed today are really exciting to see these conversations continuing forward. With that, we're right on time to wrap up the presentation. So thank you all so much, and I wish you all the best on the rest of your BTR conference. Take care.
Yeah.